It was supposed to be a quiet morning, the kind where you sit on the porch with a hot cup of coffee, watching the mist roll over the trees. Just peace, quiet, and the sound of birds waking up. But then, out of nowhere, came the low hum of engines. At first it was distant, almost easy to ignore. But then the sound grew louder. Tires crunching on gravel, engines revving, doors slamming. I frowned, setting my mug down. That wasn't normal. This was my land, miles away from the nearest town. No one ever came down this road unless they had a reason. I stood up and stepped onto the dirt path leading toward my driveway. And that's when I saw it. A line of cars, SUVs, and campers stretched down the road, kicking up dust like some kind of parade. I squinted. Maybe someone had the wrong address. Maybe it was a church retreat or a lost hiking group. But as the first cars pulled onto my property, it became clear. They weren't lost. They were settling in. People spilled out of their vehicles like they had just arrived at a summer vacation spot. A few stretched their arms and yawned, taking in the scenery. Others popped open trunks and started unloading coolers, folding chairs, and was that a full-sized barbecue grill? Someone had already started staking down a tent near my favorite tree. I watched, stunned, as a guy in flip-flops casually tied a hammock between two oaks, testing its strength like he had all the time in the world. I rubbed my temples. This had to be a mistake. No one in their right mind would just show up on private property and start setting up like they owned the place. And then I saw her. Marching down the gravel path like she was leading an army came Karen. Clipboard in one hand, her other swinging with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. Her signature smug expression was already in place, the kind that said, "I know best, and you're going to listen," inhaled deeply, then let out a slow breath. I put my coffee down before I was tempted to throw it. Something told me I was going to need both hands for this conversation. Karen's voice cut through the morning air like nails on a chalkboard. "Morning, neighbor," she chirped, striding toward me with that fake cheerfulness she always used when she wanted something. I barely had time to process the absolute chaos unfolding on my land before she hit me with her next line. "We really appreciate your generous donation to the HOA's annual camping retreat." I blinked. "Excuse me? What now?" I looked at the crowd. Dozens of people unloading supplies, setting up tents, treating my property like some kind of nature resort. Surely I misheard her. There was no way she actually thought I had donated my land for this. I took a step forward, making sure my voice was clear and firm. "Karen, this is my private property. None of these people have permission to be here." She let out a breezy laugh and waved a hand like I was being ridiculous. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. We're all neighbors. It's just one weekend." I stared at her, struggling to process the sheer audacity. She really thought she could just show up with 100 people and claim my land as a community event space? "Karen, I'm not part of the HOA. Your rules don't apply here." For the first time, her confidence wavered. It was brief, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but she recovered quickly. "Well, you should be," she said with a forced smile. "Besides, the rest of us already agreed on this. It's too late to change plans now." Before I could respond, a loud, disgusted shriek cut through the air. "You gross! There's poop everywhere!" I turned to see a teenage girl hopping on one foot, staring in horror at the fresh cow manure now smeared across her shoe. Her mom gasped, looking around in sudden panic. "Wait, you mean this isn't a proper campsite? There aren't any bathrooms?" Nearby, a man in a Hawaiian shirt sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. "What is that smell?" I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. These people came out here thinking they were getting a neatly maintained campground with fire pits and clean walking trails. Instead, they got real nature, complete with mud, manure, and whatever else my land had to offer. Karen, however, still wasn't giving up. She squared her shoulders, determined to push forward. But now, the cracks in her plan were starting to show. Karen was getting desperate now. She crossed her arms and let out an exaggerated sigh, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "We've already planned this. People took time off work. We can't cancel now." I didn't even blink. "Not my problem." Her face twisted with frustration. "Well, we live in a democracy, don't we? Let's put it to a vote." I stared at her, genuinely baffled. "A vote? You think you can vote to take over my land?" She lifted her chin like she was making some grand speech. "We should be able to. This is about community." That was it. I was done wasting breath on this nonsense. I pulled out my phone, keeping my voice calm. "All right, Karen. If you want to play games, let me introduce you to my security detail." I dialed a number and simply said, "It's time." Karen had been mid-rant, but now she hesitated. "Time for what?" Her answer came from behind the barn. 6 massive dogs emerged, moving in perfect sync. Their black coats gleamed in the sunlight, muscles rippling beneath. They weren't barking. They didn't need to. Their presence alone made the air feel heavier. Titan, the biggest of them, a Belgian Malinois built like a small bear, let out a low, rumbling growl. Not loud. Just enough to send a clear message. Dead silence. A bag of marshmallows slipped from someone's hands, landing in the dirt. A woman behind her husband whispered, Are those friendly?" I smirked. "Depends." Karen's face had lost all color. You can't just bring attack dogs into this." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but you can bring 100 strangers onto my land?" Titan took a slow, calculated step forward. That was all it took. Instant panic. People scrambled for their things, stuffing tents half collapsed into their trunks, knocking over coolers in their rush. A dad abandoned his hammock, not even bothering to untie it. A family sprinted to their van, throwing bags inside without checking if they were zipped. Karen stood frozen for a second, looking like she wanted to argue. But then Titan let out another low growl, and that was enough. She turned on her heel and bolted. Karen's face was still twisted with anger, but now there was a hint of desperation creeping in. Her last ounce of confidence was slipping. "I'm calling the cops," she screeched. "You'll be arrested for threatening innocent families." I leaned against my porch, completely unfazed, and pulled out my own phone. Already did. Right on cue, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Karen's smug expression faltered. A minute later, 2 squad cars rolled up, kicking up dust as they pulled onto the property. Her jaw dropped. She had not expected this. The officers stepped out, one of them clearly the veteran type, graying mustache, no patience for nonsense. He took one look at the scene before turning to Karen. "Ma'am, do you have written permission to be here?" Karen shifted uncomfortably. "Well, the HOA agreed." The officer cut her off. "That's not what I asked. Do you have written permission from the owner?" Silence. A few campers looked at each other, the realization hitting them all at once. Karen might have just dragged them into a massive mistake. I didn't say a word, just pulled a folder from the porch table and handed it to the officer. He flipped through the papers, nodding as he scanned the documents. "Yep. Private property. HOA has no jurisdiction here." He turned back to Karen, his voice firm. "Ma'am, you and your group are trespassing. You have 10 minutes to leave." Karen's face went from pale to bright red in record time. But we planned this for months. We printed schedules. The officer didn't even blink. Not his problem. Leave. She opened her mouth again, probably to launch into another rant, but before she could, Titan let out one final commanding bark. That was the breaking point. Panic spread through the campers again, and whatever was left of their organized retreat collapsed completely. People yanked tents out of the ground without bothering to fold them. Car doors slammed. A dad tried to shove a still inflated air mattress into his trunk. Karen stood frozen in disbelief, watching her grand plan fall apart. I gave her a small wave. See you at the next HOA meeting, Karen. Oh wait, no, I won't. And with that, she stomped to her car, muttering under her breath, and peeled out of there like the road was on fire. A few days passed, and just when I thought the madness was over, I got a letter in the mail. The county office. I opened it up and actually laughed out loud. Karen had filed a formal complaint against me, listing a whole mess of bogus claims, environmental hazards, public safety concerns, and, of course, aggressive animals. Oh, she was still trying. I wasn't about to let her nonsense slide, so I made a few calls and scheduled a hearing at the county office. If she wanted a fight, she was about to lose it in the most official way possible. The day of the hearing, I walked in to find Karen already seated, her arms crossed, smug as ever. She barely glanced at me before muttering, "You'll regret messing with me." I ignored her and took my seat. A county official, a middle-aged woman with the tired look of someone who had seen far too much paperwork, started reading through Karen's complaint. "You're claiming environmental damage, safety violations, and dangerous animals on this property?" she asked, looking over her glasses at Karen. Karen sat up straighter. "Yes. This man keeps dangerous attack dogs on his land. He put dozens of families at risk." I stayed quiet, waiting for my turn. The official turned to me. "Do you have any response to these allegations?" Wordlessly, I pulled out a thick folder. Inside were copies of my property rights, county permits, and, my personal favorite, security footage from that day. I handed it over, and the room went quiet as the official reviewed the evidence. The video clearly showed Karen leading an entire group of trespassers onto my land, completely uninvited. It even caught her little, "We should vote to take over this land" speech. After a few minutes, the official sighed and closed the folder. "This complaint holds no legal weight. Dismissed." Karen's head snapped up. "What?" The official didn't even look at her. "Furthermore, if you continue to file false claims, you will be subject to legal consequences." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. She looked like she wanted to scream, but for once, she had nothing to say. Without another word, she stood up, grabbed her bag, and stormed out of the office. I leaned back in my chair, letting the victory sink in. Karen had tried every trick in the book, and she had lost every single time. A few days later, I sat on my porch, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm oranges and purples. My dogs lounged around me, relaxed now that the chaos was over. Titan stretched out with a satisfied groan, clearly enjoying the peace as much as I was. The land was mine again. Quiet, safe, just the way it was supposed to be. I took a deep breath, letting the victory sink in. Karen had pulled every trick she could think of, and in the end, she'd lost. There was something deeply satisfying about that. But of course, Karen wasn't the type to go down gracefully. Just as I was starting to enjoy the moment, the sound of screeching tires shattered the calm. An SUV skidded to a stop at the edge of my driveway. I didn't even have to look. I already knew who it was. Karen. She jumped out, face red with fury, and stormed toward me, jabbing a finger in my direction. "This isn't over," she spat, practically shaking with rage. I took a slow sip of my coffee, then smirked. "Try me." For a second, I thought she might actually explode. Instead, she let out a frustrated yell, stomped back to her car, and sped off into the night. I watched the taillights disappear down the road and chuckled to myself. Something told me this wouldn't be the last time I had to deal with Karen. But if she wanted another fight, I'd be ready.